If you have a Bible, we will be looking at Psalm chapter 16 this morning. I'm sorry to disappoint you. I am not JC, you may have noticed. And we are preaching a psalm this morning, which I know is not in the series you've been in. Psalm 16 is a fascinating psalm, and it's a psalm really about joy, which is what I would like to call the sermon, is fullness of joy. And I know everything going on in JC's family and probably many things going on in your life. You might wonder if this is an appropriate time to speak of joy, but I think there are good reasons to say yes, it is. And so if you'll join me as we read Psalm 16. A miktam of David. Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you. As for the saints in the land, they are the excellent ones, in whom is all my delight. The sorrows of those who run after another god shall multiply. Their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out, or take their name on my lips. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. I have set the Lord always before me. Because he is my right hand, I shall not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad, my whole being rejoices. My flesh also dwells secure. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the path of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. The word of the Lord. In Psalm 16, David is contemplating the complex subject of human happiness. It's a subject that I have contemplated quite often over the last few years because I happen to be the father of what some purely objective people have said is the happiest daughter of all time. My daughter, Eloise, who is turning 3 in March, when she was born, was an immensely joyful baby. And if I had a picture, I would show you of her when she was 2 weeks old. Just this massive smile on her face and beaming all the time. And I'm sure many of you would, what would you say, be skeptical of my objectivity. You would say, surely every happy parent, feigns over their own child and thinks that they're the happiest baby there ever was. But I did have a second child, a son. So now I have, as it were, a point of reference. And what I can tell you is he definitely is not as happy as my daughter was. My son, Alden, has the superpower of crying crocodile tears in one moment and then laughing in the next moment and then crying more crocodile tears in the next moment. And kids are great. You've probably heard it said that kids are a mirror, and they certainly are. You will see not only your features, but perhaps even your failures, maybe hopefully some of your triumphs reflected to you in your kids. But I also think that kids are more than mirrors, they're also windows. And I think we can see through them some pretty profound things. From Eloise, what I see is the power of joy, like the magnetism of it. How she almost has a cult following at our church of teenagers who just follow her all around the building. And from Alden, what I see is the frailty of joy, the weakness of it, and how in this life, if we're honest, we know that our joy is constantly threatened by sorrow. There is a real challenge to finding happiness in this life, and some of us are blessed enough to find great moments of happiness. But even if we do find it, then we have the new problem of how can we hold it? How can we keep it? Our happiness is under assault from many things around us, leading us to crocodile tears. And what I like about Psalm 16 is David, the author of this psalm, he saw something truly wonderful. What he sees in the psalm is what he calls a refuge. You might say he finds a fortress for his happiness. And this morning, what I'm hoping we can do is try to see what David sees. He saw a path of life that could lead not only to fullness of joy, but the pleasures forevermore. And you can't have it more than full, and you can't have it longer than forever. And so let's see if we can see what David saw as we move through the psalm. We'll see the source of joy, the experience of joy, and finally the reason for it. The source of joy, the experience of joy, and finally the reason for joy. So first is the source of joy. The heading for this psalm is a miktam of David. And the headings are actually part of the original scripture. In the Hebrew Bible, that's actually verse 1. It's kind of interesting. A miktam. If you don't know what a miktam is, that's okay. No one else does either, which is why we say a miktam. So whenever you see a Hebrew word in the Bible just sort of transliterated or spelled out in English letters like miktam or selah or something like this, that means the translator is punting, right? No one knows what a miktam is. They think it might mean something like an inscription, but it is unclear. However, there are 5 other psalms that are called miktams, and they all occur in Psalm 56 through 60. And if you go and look at these other miktam psalms, one of the things they all have in common is David is always in some sort of predicament in those psalms. So he's fleeing from Saul, or he's in Gath, the city of the Philistines, running for his life. And this has led many people to think that the context of Psalm 16 is a miktam context, is a context of some sort of danger. And one passage in the Old Testament seems to fit really well with Psalm 16, and that is 1 Samuel 26, verses 19 to 20, which in this story, David is on the run because Saul, who's the king of Israel, is jealous of David and wants to kill him. This is actually the second time this has happened, that David sees Saul sleeping and sneaks up to him and takes something that belongs to him, just so that Saul knows, I could have killed you, but I did not. So stop trying to kill me. And in 1 Samuel 26, verses 19 to 20, David is speaking with King Saul, and this is what he says. David says, "Men have driven me out this day, that I should have no share in the heritage of the Lord, saying, go and serve other gods. Now therefore let not my blood fall to the earth, away from the presence of the Lord." And if you read that closely, the vocabulary and some of the themes in those verses in 1 Samuel about having a heritage, about serving other gods, about the presence of the Lord, those themes and that vocabulary maps on really well to Psalm 16, which has led many commentators to think that the historical context of Psalm 16 is likely David on the run from King Saul. David is in danger. And that makes this psalm all the more interesting because David is writing this hymn of joy, as it were, from a place of darkness, from a really hard, potentially life-threatening experience. And he is able, in that dark experience, to explore the true source of joy, where joy can truly be found. And he states it both positively and negatively in our text. He tells us where joy cannot be found, and he also tells us where it can be. Negatively, in verse 4, he says this is not where you find joy. Verse 4 says this, "The sorrows of those who run after another god shall multiply. Their drink offerings of blood I will not pour out, or take their name on my lips. The sorrows of those who run after another god shall multiply. I will not pour out their drink offerings of blood." Now, I don't know about you, but when I read the Bible, I often try to connect and relate to it, especially in the Psalms, which are prayers and songs. And my first thought when I read this is, I don't know if I can exactly relate to part of this verse. When David says, I will not pour out their drink offerings of blood. I don't know about you, but of all the bad things I was tempted to do this past week, one of them was not to pour out blood on the ground in honor of a pagan god of the land of Canaan. That's just not something I deal with. I don't know about you. And so if your first thought upon reading this, like mine was, I can't really relate to that, that's okay. That was my first thought. But upon closer inspection, we would both be wrong, because we actually really can relate to what David is saying here. It's not just antiquated. And the person who explains this best of all is the late great, or new and greater, depending on how you think about it, Tim Keller. Tim Keller is well known for his theology of idols and showing us how idols very much exist today. In the ancient world, they were made of metal idols, but today they're mental. mental idols, which are things that we love. And normally they're good things, not bad things. This is what Tim Keller says. The most powerful idols are good things that we turn into ultimate things. So, family is a very powerful idol. Either your parents' approval or your children doing well. Career and money, of course, is. Achievement, acclaim. Your looks, the looks of your partner, your moral record, your moral decency, any kind of romantic relationship, some political or social cause, your competence and skill. These things are all good things, but they all are potential idols. He preaches a great sermon, actually, from the book of Acts. His sermon is so much better than mine. I really should have just read his to you this morning. But what he says is so interesting. He says, when you go back to the ancient times, there was a god in every corner. There was a sex god and a war god and a work god and a play god. Everybody had a god. There was a god behind everything, an agricultural god, a financial god, a god of the arts and a god of the music. And you say, this is Tim Keller, wow, isn't that weird? What a superstitious people. And we as moderns kind of look down on them. But here's what Keller says. He says, don't you understand? He's like, they understood something. They were overt about something that we are covert about. They were explicit and actually conscious of something that we are completely unconscious of, which is that any relationship, any activity, anything in this world can be turned into a kind of salvation, a kind of God, a kind of source of our hope and meaning. And then what we're doing is we don't call it that, but what we do is we're worshiping that thing. Once we've turned it into I must have that. Sure, I can be a Christian and go to church and I can be a good person, but I've got to have this thing. If I can't have this thing or have this thing in this way, then I'll never be happy. And Keller not only is great to quote, but he's also a treasure trove of good quotes that he finds. And he found a quote from a person I couldn't find the name of, but a very insightful person, not a Christian. And this person had actually lived in 3 different major U.S. cities throughout the course of their life. They had lived in Boston, in Washington, D.C., and in New York. And this is a quote that Keller pulled. I couldn't find the original quote, but this is what this person had said. Again, not a Christian, but this person said, "The God of Boston is knowledge and education, and the God of Washington, D.C. is power and influence, but the God of New York City is money. And if you don't believe New York City worships the God of money, I want you to realize, here's the evidence, every year thousands of children are sacrificed. New York is one of the places where they practice child sacrifice because every year thousands of children in their best interests are sacrificed for the money and career of their parents." Now that's a very insightful thing for someone who's not even a Christian to realize, is that there is a way that even we as modern people are worshiping false gods. Gods, lowercase g, are not like little nymphs, hiding behind bushes in the forest. Even the ancients didn't think that. The gods, the false idols that we chase, it's not a concept that we're unfamiliar with. It's a concept that we are so familiar with that we might just forget about it. It's like the wallpaper of our every waking moment. It could be anything in the world that we're chasing, we're craving to fill this desire to be happy. And I like this quote because it makes you stop and ask, if those are the gods of Boston and DC and New York, well, what are the gods, lowercase g, of Phoenix? And what are the gods of Queen Creek, where you are? They might be different than the lowercase g gods of Chandler, where I am. What are these false gods, these things calling us like sirens that are enticing us to make an offering to them and not to the one true and living God? David says joy can't be found in any God but the true and living God. If we chase after these gods, if our New Year's resolutions are honoring these gods and not the one true God, our sorrows will multiply, is what he says. Joy cannot be found there. But positively, David says, this is where you can find joy. In verse 2, David says this, "I say to the Lord, you are my Lord. I have no good apart from you." Now, reading that in English, it sounds a little redundant and almost nonsensical to say, "I say to the Lord, you are my Lord." But what you need to understand is that in the Bible, when you see Lord with like all capital letters, that is actually translating a name. Yahweh, which was the covenantal name of God, and in the Hebrew Bible and in the Greek translations of it, all the way into the present with most English translations, instead of spelling out that name, a name so sacred the Jews would not even say it, they put Lord in capital letters like that, where it's really referring to God's name, his covenantal identity, Yahweh. So you might make this more better English if you sort of paraphrased it. I say to Yahweh, you are my master. Those are two different Hebrew words, Lord and Lord. One is saying Yahweh. David is calling God by name. In other words, he's saying, it's not these false gods, it's not the gods around me that will bring joy, but it's you. It's this covenantal God as he's revealed in Scripture. In the Torah, David says, you are my master, you are my owner, you possess me, you captivate me, you own me, you are the one I belong to. And then David gets even more clear when he says this in the second half of the verse. He says, I have no good apart from you. Not I have some other good things in addition to you, but I have no good apart from you. And in fact, the preposition there is really interesting in Hebrew. It's a kind of strange usage that a lot of translations might even put it as, I have no good beyond you. So the idea is like this. He's not only saying, I can't have joy apart from you, God, but there's nothing past you that can bring me joy. Like if our journey to find joy was a metro, God would be the very last stop. There is nothing past him. He's saying, I can't have joy, God, without you, but I also know that there is nothing more past you, beyond you, that really would bring me joy. And practically this means at least two things. The first is, it means that you and I, we actually can't be happy without the help of God. We can't even enjoy happiness in anything without God's help. An interesting verse is Psalm chapter 4, verse 7, where David says this. He says, you, God, have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine are abounding. And if you listen really carefully to what he's saying, it's actually something pretty astounding. He says, God, you have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine is abounding. In other words, he's saying God himself is the one who actually gives us joy, who puts joy into our heart. It's not the grain and wine that abounding that brings joy. It's God. If you ate a piece of cake over New Year's, or if you drink a cup of coffee, if you see a beautiful sunrise, if you listen to a piece of music, if you have a friend, all of those joys that you experience, the source of the joy is not the thing itself, it's actually God. He's the one who puts joy in our heart. We can't be happy without God's help. That's the first thing it means. But the second thing it means is this, is that the ultimate object of our joy is in fact God. God is the highest thing, the highest source of joy there is. He is in fact the fountainhead of all joys. Jonathan Edwards, a great theologian who I honestly can't claim to understand most of what he writes, but the few things you do understand, you really latch onto. Jonathan Edwards is known for being a theologian of joy, a theologian of exploring pleasure and how God is the source of this. And this is what he writes. He says, the enjoyment of God is the only happiness with which our souls can be satisfied. To go to heaven fully to enjoy God is infinitely better than the most pleasant accommodations here. Fathers and mothers, husbands, wives or children, the company of earthly friends are but shadows. God is the substance. These are but scattered beams, but God is the sun. These are but streams. God is the ocean. All of this raises a great question for us to ask, which is this: do you love God? Not just things that are God adjacent, but do you actually love God himself? It's great to be passionate about theology and church and missions and social causes, but with David, do we know God by name? Do we speak to him as one with whom we are intimate? And do we love God in himself and not just the things that are God adjacent? We need to go as it were, from the streams into the ocean. This is something that both Edwards and David, it seems, could do. Which leads us to our second point, the experience of joy. God is the source of joy. But how is it we can actually experience him, and what does that look like? And I think if we look at what David says going on in the psalm, he tells us that experiencing God's joy, two things, has tangible results and involves our total being. Tangible results in our total being. So the first is experiencing joy in God, for David, seems to have very tangible results. And we see this in verses 5 to 6, where David says, "The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance." Now, the language that David is using here to describe his experience of God's joy is kind of interesting. He's using the language of land ownership, of the language of purchasing property. Now, in our modern world, owning property is something that we view differently than they did in the ancient world. You might own a piece of land, you might own multiple pieces of land, but more than likely, when you think of your net worth, you're not thinking of a terrain as much as like a number. When you think of your inheritance, your legacy, when you think of your total sum value, you're normally thinking of a big number somewhere, or the combination of multiple numbers once they all sort of balance out. But in the ancient world, land was viewed much differently, because land was everything. It was your bank. It was your job. It was your investment. It was your retirement. It's what you were going to pass on to your kids. Land was everything, from your source of food to where you laid your head. It was your 401k. To modernize Psalm 16:5 here, it would be like David saying, "God, you are my bank account. You are my 401k. You are my net worth." So David is saying, interestingly, experiencing a joy in God is like owning a piece of land. But here's the kicker. David is saying this at a time when he was not living on the land. He was not enjoying the benefits of owning property in this moment. He is running for his life. He might be literally hiding out in a cave somewhere. And yet, it's in this very moment that David is able to say, "God, you are my slice of land. You hold my lot." The lot was cast to determine the boundaries of one's property. He says, "You hold my lot. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places." And what's astounding about this is that David is able to say, "God, you are my slice of land," in a moment when he's actually doesn't own a slice of land at all. He's able to say, basically, "I don't have this right now, but I don't need it, because what I have in you, God, is that for me." And if we can see what David is doing here, it's actually very radical. Because what David is saying is he's saying his experience of God is able not only to meet a need, but to be better than owning something that he really wants. Here's why this matters, because not everyone gets to have everything. Not everyone is born wealthy. Not everyone is beautiful. Not everyone is successful. Not everyone has a good family or a happy family. Not everyone has good physical health or good mental health. Not everyone has access to friends and resources and experiences. We don't get to have everything in this life, but what David is saying is that if we can experience God in the way he's experiencing God, then we can be okay with the pluses and the minuses that we have in this life. We can have joy. God can actually put joy in our heart in the absence of something that we really want. And it's better than when the grain and wine abound. Charles Spurgeon said, "In contemplating Christ, there's a balm for every wound. In musing on the Father, a quietus for every grief. And in the influence of the Holy Ghost, a balsam for every sore. Would you lose your sorrow? Would you drown your cares? Then go, plunge yourself in the Godhead's deepest sea. Be lost in his immensity. You shall come forth as from a couch of rest." For David, joy in God is not merely theoretical. It's very tangible. it actually impacts the way he thinks and the way he feels. And this brings us to the second part here. It's not only tangible, but experiencing God involves your total being. By total being, what I mean is it's intellectual, it's emotional, it's physical, it's a full human experience. It's interesting in this psalm, the number of organs that are named. In fact, in verse 7, you might have a footnote. It says, "In the night, my heart instructs me," footnote, it's actually my kidney instructs me. In the ancient, Israel, they thought maybe the kidney was the seat of the conscience or something. But that doesn't play well in poetry, If you go up to your spouse on Valentine's Day and say, "I love you with all my kidney," that's not going to work for you. So we're grappling to figure out what these ancient organs mean and what they understood them to mean. But the point is this: David is saying, it's all of me. He says in verse 9, "My heart is glad, my whole being rejoices, my flesh dwells secure." What David is basically saying is this is a total human self-response to find joy in God. True joy in God, to say it this way, is found not only in orthodoxy, which is thinking right. You maybe heard of orthodoxy. In the PCA, we love to think right. It's better to think right than to think wrong, so why would you? Orthodoxy. But there's also orthopraxy, which is doing right, which is right behavior. That gets a little less airtime. But I wonder if you've ever heard anyone talk to you about orthopathos, which is right feeling. Because the Bible has just as much to say about orthopathos as it does orthodoxy and orthopraxy, which is to say, the Bible often commands us not only to think a certain way or to do certain things, but even to feel a certain way. I mean, think about all the places that we're commanded to rejoice always, to be glad. God commands a certain emotional response from us. It matters because it's actually the very reason he created us. Back to Edwards, he says, the reason God created man was for man to be happy, for the very end that he might communicate happiness to him. And he goes on to say this: God is glorified not only in his glories being seen, but by it being rejoiced in. When those that see it delight in it, God is more glorified than if they only see it. Did you hear what Edwards says here? It's very profound. He says, when those who see God's glory delight in it, God is more glorified than if only they see it. This is why John Piper has a famous saying, God is most glorified when we are most satisfied in him. It's not just enough to see it, to see the right theology. We have to sing the theology. We have to feel the theology. David did. And it's just as available to us as it was to him. David had great joy, and he had a great reason for it. It's our last point. The reason for joy. Look over here at verse 10. David says, "You will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption." He says, "For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol." So David grounds all of these sublime feelings in this. And to be quick with it, it's the gospel. David's joy is a gospel joy. He had a joy that this God who created him, and even was his God through the midst of terrible times, was not going to abandon him to the shadowy land of the other world. He wasn't going to let his Holy One see corruption. God would keep his promises. And it's not exactly clear how much David understood what he was saying, but it's very clear in the New Testament to Peter and Paul what David was saying. We read from Acts 13 where Paul says, quoting Psalm 16 here, both Peter in Acts 2 and Paul in Acts 13, they see this psalm and they say, oh, we get it. It's about Jesus. It's about the resurrection. David's joy is a gospel joy, just like our joy is today. I took a deep dive into the stages of decay of the human body at death, and I don't encourage you to follow me down that rabbit hole, but it is true that after 72 hours, the body begins to bloat and then rot, liquefy, and all of this. And the conundrum of Psalm 16 is that David clearly did see corruption. As Micah read earlier from Acts chapter 13, David saw corruption. His body did corrupt and rot and decay. In fact, there's only one person whose body did not corrupt and rot and see decay, and that is Jesus. Jesus' body did not see 72 hours of death because, strangely, what began happening is his heart began beating, his lungs began expanding, his fingers began drumming, his eyelids opened. Jesus rose from the dead. He defeated death. He claimed all the promises made to David and his offspring in this text and others, because Jesus is the Holy One of God who did not see corruption. And that brought joy to David, but it brought even more joy, if I can say it, to Peter and to Paul, and it should to us, because the resurrection means something. It means two things. One is historical and one is future. The historical thing is it means that Jesus is no ordinary man. He has to be God. No other human could do what Jesus did in rising from the dead in their body. It puts Jesus in a completely different league from Joseph Smith or Muhammad or Buddha. He is not like them. Our entire faith is rooted in the historical fact of the resurrection. It's why we're all in this gymnasium this morning singing songs, is because we believe that Jesus bodily rose from the dead. But the resurrection also means one other thing. It means something for the future. What it means is that we too will be resurrected with Jesus. We too have a hope of resurrection, because Jesus was constantly telling his disciples, I am the way. I am the path of life. You can have fullness of joy. You can have pleasures forevermore. And because he rose from the dead, he's good on keeping his word. Jesus is promising a resurrection for us. And resurrection, the whole point of it, I'll end with this, is not just prolonged existence, but resurrection means a new and better identity. It means a better destiny. It means life on a higher plane, if you could say it that way. I'll tell you a story, I'll give you a quote, and we'll wrap it up here. I told you kids are windows, and my daughter, sweet Eloise, was a window to me of this profound truth of a higher life, of a new identity, and of a better destiny, if you could call it that. So Eloise is about to turn 3, and we've been telling her for months now that she's not a baby anymore, she's a big girl. And she really likes that. She likes to be a big girl. So she's like, I'm not a baby, I'm a big girl. And she can feed herself and almost dress herself. She's potty trained, so she's doing big girl things. So we've been saying, you're a big girl, and she's really liked internalizing that. Well, from time to time, if we're in the car or something, we'll let our kids listen to, there's a Spotify playlist called Disney Storytime, and they've got these truncated Disney movies. It's like a 10-minute, audible reading of a movie, and she's really enjoyed listening to Frozen, and she's listened to it a million times. I've listened to it, a million times. But she had never seen Frozen, because if you let your kids watch a screen, they become a monster, as we all know. So we would let her listen to it, but we, for Christmas, flew to North Carolina to see my family. And I don't know if you've ever flown with infants and toddlers, but whatever parenting principles you have are gone, right? They're checked in your baggage, because you're like, I will let you watch all the videos you want. Just please stay in your seat. So she got to watch Frozen for the first time on the plane, and it was amazing to see that story kind of expand for her. She got to hear the songs, and she had only heard it, but now she got to see the characters, and I watched her knowledge of it expand. Well, things got interesting when we got to my mom, her grandmother's house for Christmas, and what my mom, unbeknownst to me, had bought my daughter was this Elsa dress, an Elsa costume, So Eloise now basically refuses to wear anything except the Elsa dress. She's got to be wearing it all the time. The first thing she says in the morning is, "Can I wear the Elsa dress?" And she's probably wearing it right now to church, I'm sure. But anyway, the final stage in her evolution came a few days ago. We were walking back from the park past my neighbor's house. We have this very sweet neighbor, and she stepped out and she saw Eloise, and she said, "Hey, princess." And I watched something go off in Eloise's mind, and she kind of smiled, a little bit shy, and we walked a few steps further, and then she just stopped, and she looked up at me, and I saw it in her eyes, life just beaming. She said, "Dad, I'm not a big girl anymore. because I'm a princess now. like she had evolved, like she's a princess now. And now she refuses the moniker big girl. She is a princess. And, I can't wait for her to realize one day that she's more right than she even knows. Because kids are windows. It's easy to sort of laugh and dismiss this joy that they can have, but Jesus himself says, unless you become as a little kid, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. G.K. Chesterton, a great writer, has this quote about kids, and he says basically, as we get older, we're losing our life, but kids have this abundance of life inside of them. And he says this, he says, when we are very young children, we do not need fairy tales, we only need tales. Mere life is interesting enough. A child of 7 is excited by being told that Tommy opened a door and saw a dragon. But a child of 3 is excited by being told that Tommy opened a door. The thing I mean can be seen, for instance, in children when they find some game or joke that they especially enjoy. A child kicks his legs rhythmically through excess, not absence of life. Because children have abounding vitality, because they are in spirit fierce and free, therefore they want things repeated and unchanged. They always say, do it again. And the grown-up person does it again until he is nearly dead. For grown-up people are not strong enough to exult in monotony. But perhaps God is strong enough to exult in monotony. It is possible that God says every morning, do it again to the sun, and every evening, do it again to the moon. It may not be automatic necessity that makes all daisies alike. It may be that God makes every daisy separately, but has never got tired of making them. It may be that he has the eternal appetite of infancy, for we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than we. It's an interesting thought that kids can show us in a way that we might have forgotten what life is. We don't even know what life is. We haven't even started living yet. And the resurrection will not only be more alive, we'll be alive for the first time. The sort of joy we will have will be full, and you can't have more of it than full. We'll have it forever, and you can't have it longer than forever. In the resurrection, we'll all be young again. And by God's wonderful and powerful grace, we'll never grow old this time. Will you pray with me?